At 56, Elsie Mae Calder had $43.72, a green army duffel bag with her dead husband's name on the flap, and a foreclosure notice taped to the farmhouse she'd lived in for 31 years. Robert had died 14 months earlier. The medical bills took the savings. The chain stores took the repair shop. The bank took everything else. She was sleeping in his 1998 Ford Ranger behind a closed feed store in Mercy Draw, North Dakota, when she saw the auction notice in the window. A 40-acre parcel with a half-buried sod shelter 6 miles west of town. Minimum bid $25. The ranchers at the courthouse laughed when the clerk read the listing. One called it a dirt blister. Another said you'd have to be a badger to live there. Elsie raised her hand, paid $31 in cash and quarters, and drove west with less than $13 to her name. But when she started clearing the mechanical bay, she noticed a rectangle of stone that didn't match the rest of the wall, and behind it, sealed in cedar and untouched for 19 years, she found a dead man's life waiting for whoever opened the door. The bank officer crossed the road at 4:17 in the afternoon with a roll of masking tape and a printed notice. Elsie Mae Calder watched him from the passenger seat of Robert's 1998 Ford Ranger parked behind the closed feed store on the other side of the lot. The truck heater ran on high because the low setting had died 3 years ago. The passenger window would not close all the way, and a thin blade of December air cut across her knuckles where they rested on the green duffel bag beside her. The officer pressed the notice flat against the farmhouse door. He smoothed each corner with his palm. He did not look across the road. Elsie had signed the final foreclosure release 40 minutes earlier, in a room that smelled like toner ink and carpet adhesive. The pen was chained to the desk. The loan officer had offered her a bottle of water afterward, the way a dentist offers a rinse cup after pulling a tooth. She opened the duffel bag with cold fingers. The zipper caught on the broken tooth near the top, the same one that had been broken since Robert packed the bag for a fishing trip in 2019. His name was still written in black marker on the inside flap. She checked the contents the way she checked them every night, not because she might have lost something, but because counting was the only routine she had left. 2 flannel shirts, both worn through at the elbows, a black funeral dress folded inside a grocery sack from the Piggly Wiggly on Route 5, Robert's leather storm notebook with cracked corners, a blue enamel cup, speckled metal, chipped white along the rim, dented at the bottom so it rocked slightly when she set it down. A tobacco tin holding 3 photographs and $12 in quarters. A silver thimble wrapped in a scrap of yellow flour sack cloth. She zipped the bag closed and pulled the tobacco tin into her lap. Under the dome light behind the feed store, she counted 43 72s. She counted it twice because the first time her fingers were too stiff to separate the bills. The farmhouse across the road had been hers for 31 years. Robert had died in the back bedroom 14 months ago, after the diagnosis ate through their savings, their credit, and every payment plan the hospital would accept. The repair shop had already failed by then. Chain stores had undercut his labor rates until the phone stopped ringing. Elsie had become a nurse, bookkeeper, driver, and creditor negotiator. Her hands had stopped building things because survival took all their strength. She did not drive past Beth's old elementary school on the way out of town. She had called Beth 4 times in the last 2 weeks. The voicemail greeting played each time. Beth's voice, bright and professional, a voice that belonged to a woman 3 counties east who did not answer her mother's calls. Elsie adjusted the truck vent with the butter knife she kept in the console. The blade fit the stripped screw head better than any screwdriver she had left. She angled the warm air toward her hands, set the blue enamel cup in the holder with the last inch of cold coffee still in it, and pulled onto the county road. The feed store window caught her headlights as she turned. A notice was taped to the glass. County seal in the corner, black ink on yellow paper. Tax delinquent property, Lot 7, Whitaker Switch House, County Road 9. Minimum bid $25. She read it twice. She read the address. She read the minimum bid. She looked at the tobacco tin on the seat. She drove back to the motel she could not afford, sat in the parking lot with the engine running, and read the notice again from memory. The county courthouse basement smelled like floor wax, old radiator dust, and the coffee someone had burned in the break room upstairs. Fluorescent tubes hummed above 4 rows of metal folding chairs, half of them occupied. Ranchers stood along the back wall with their arms crossed and their caps still on. A woman from the clerk's office arranged papers on a folding table at the front. Lot 1 went to a man in a Carhartt jacket for $200, a quarter section with good fencing and a stock pond. Lot 4 drew a bidding war between 2 ranchers over grazing rights. The auctioneer worked through each parcel with the pace of someone who had done this quarterly for 20 years. Lot 7, the clerk read, Whitaker Switch House, 40-acre parcel, County Road 9, 6 miles west of Mercy Draw. Structures include 1 sod-bermed Quonset-style shelter, non-residential, no current utilities on record, tax delinquent since 2007, minimum bid $25. A man in the second row leaned to his neighbor. That dirt blister? You'd have to be a badger to live there, the neighbor said. Laughter moved through the room like a draft. The auctioneer waited for it to pass. Elsie raised her hand. The room was quiet. The auctioneer looked at her, looked at the back wall, looked at the room. No one else moved. Sold to Mrs. Calder, $31. She paid at the folding table with bills and quarters from the tobacco tin. The clerk counted each coin, stamped the receipt, and slid a manila envelope across the table. Inside, a quitclaim deed with a coffee stain on the lower left corner, 2 brass keys on a wire ring, and a plat map folded wrong. Mrs. Calder, the clerk said, not looking up from her stamp pad, you just bought a hole in the wind. Elsie put the keys in her coat pocket and the envelope inside the duffel bag. She walked out of the courthouse with less than $13 to her name. The keys clicked against the blue enamel cup in the truck's cup holder all the way west on County Road 9. She passed the diner with its neon coffee cup buzzing in the window. She passed the shuttered implement dealer, its lot empty except for a rusted disc harrow no one had come back for. 9 miles of cut stubble fields stretched flat to the horizon, brown and frozen, with snow caught in the furrow lines like thread in a seam. She crossed 2 cattle guards, the truck rattling hard over the pipes, and past the Varick Ranch sign, new steel posts, glossy white lettering, bolted in place the way a man bolts down something he wants everyone to notice. Half a mile past the Varick sign, County Road 9 curved south, and Elsie saw it. The Whitaker Switch House looked like a mound of earth with a door. Buffalo grass rippled over the roof in the wind. The front wall was timber, painted white a long time ago, now peeled to gray and streaked with rust stains from the stovepipe. The pipe itself stuck up from the roof mound like a black finger pointing at nothing. The south window was cracked in a spiderweb pattern. The dirt berms on 3 sides rose to meet the curved corrugated roof, so that from the road, the building appeared half swallowed by the prairie. She parked the Ranger 10 feet from the front wall and sat with the engine running. The wind hit the truck broadside and rocked it once. On the flat land behind her, half a mile east, the new Varick Ranch bunkhouse rose like a wooden barracks. Long, thin walls, tall roofline, exposed to every mile of north wind. Hammering carried faintly from that direction, the sound arriving in flat, delayed strikes. Elsie took the brass key from her pocket. She walked to the front door, which hung low on one hinge, the bottom edge gouging an arc into the plank threshold. She worked graphite from a pencil stub into the lock, turning the pencil slowly against the pins, then fit the key and turned it. The latch clicked. The door scraped open, and she stepped inside. The first smell was dry soil, old ash, and mouse nests. Cold iron underneath everything, like the smell of a cellar in November. The entry mudroom had a low ceiling, plank floor rough under her boots, and a row of iron hooks along the left wall. 3 of the hooks still held wire hangers. A cracked mirror hung crooked beside a line of empty nail holes, and the glass gave back a version of Elsie that was too dark and too narrow. She did not stop to look. The main room opened beyond a timber-framed doorway. Curved, corrugated steel ribs arched overhead, bolted to timber purlins at 4-foot intervals. The lower walls were packed earth, lime-washed white decades ago, now chalked and cracking. 2 narrow windows were set deep into the front wall, each one barely 18 inches wide, the glass thick and bubbled in the old way. A potbelly stove sat on a slate pad near the center of the room. The stove door hung open. Ash lay in a cone below the grate, undisturbed for years. Elsie knelt beside the stove and pressed her palm against the firebox wall. Cold. She checked the flue handle, frozen with rust but not broken. She stood and moved into the room. The kitchen corner held a small sink with a hand pump, an enamel-top table with 3 mismatched chairs, and empty shelves lined with old newspaper from 1987. A rusted coffee percolator sat on the shelf nearest the stove. Elsie picked it up, turned it over, and set it on the enamel table beside the blue cup she'd carried from the truck. The cup rocked once on its dented bottom and went still. The back mechanical bay ran the full width of the building. A workbench stretched along the far wall, heavy timber, scarred with tool marks and drill holes. A pegboard above it held the outlines of tools and dust, wrenches, pliers, a hand plane, all gone. Rusted kerosene cans lined the floor. A covered cistern box sat in the corner, its plywood lid warped and water-stained. Shelves along the side wall held gaskets, stove bolts, lantern mantles, and jars of square nails sorted by size. Elsie ran her fingers along the workbench edge and stopped. She crouched. On the underside of the bench, scratched into the wood with a nail or a knife point, were 2 letters and a year. R.C. 1985. Robert Calder. 1985. He would have been 17. She pressed her thumb into the grooves of the letters. The wood was smooth inside the cuts, polished by years of someone's hand touching the same spot. She stayed there for a long time, crouched in the mechanical bay, her thumb in the letters her dead husband had carved when he was still a boy. She did not say anything. She stood, wiped her eyes with her sleeve, and went down. The root cellar hatch was a trapdoor under a braided rug in the back corner of the main room. Stone steps led down to a narrow space lined with shelves of empty mason jars. The air was cool and dry, the kind of air that stays the same temperature in July and January. One wall had newer mortar than the others, lighter in color, smoother at the joints, but Elsie filed that detail without acting on it. She came back up, walked outside, and circled the building. 40 acres of flat prairie stretched in every direction. Barbed wire sagged along the section line to the north, the posts leaning east from years of wind. A dead cottonwood stood near the draw, its bark stripped white by weather. To the east, the Varick bunkhouse rose in its raw lumber frame, pale and exposed. Elsie crouched beside the west berm and pushed her hand into the sod. The root layer was thick, tangled, and solid. She brushed dirt from the limestone footing where the berm met the foundation. Dry. No cracks, no shifting. She stood and looked at the building again. The steel ribs had surface rust, nothing deeper. The limestone footings were dry and level. The buried walls had not moved. The roof curve carried weight cleanly into the berms the way it was designed to, a shape that let wind pass over it instead of pushing against it. The building was ugly, strange, and neglected, but it was not weak. That evening, she cleaned the stovepipe enough to risk a small fire. She used the red-handled pry bar 18 inches long, paint worn off the grip, a thumbprint of Robert's old grease near the bend, to lever the stove door back into its track. She fed the fire with broken shelf boards and a handful of newspaper from 1987. She ate half a ham sandwich she had saved from the courthouse vending machine. She drank melted snow from the blue enamel cup. She laid Robert's coat on the plank floor beside the stove, set the duffel bag for a pillow, and placed the pry bar within arm's reach. The curved ceiling faded into orange stove glow above her. The chipped blue cup sat on the enamel table, catching the light. A rectangle of moonlight lay across the plank floor near the door. She stepped outside once more before she slept. The sky was black and enormous, stretched flat from horizon to horizon, and the stars were so dense they blurred together at the edges, the way they only appear where the nearest streetlight is 10 miles away. The wind crossed the roof mound without catching. It moved over the berms and kept going, the way water moves over a stone. She did not feel hope. She felt stillness, the first place in months where the wind could not reach her bones. She found it 2 days later. Elsie had been working through the mechanical bay, cleaning shelves, sorting hardware into jars, testing tools. The cistern bench in the back corner bothered her. She had measured the room by pacing it, a habit Robert had taught her, and the bench sat 8 inches closer to the center of the room than the exterior wall should allow. She let it sit in her mind for a day. On the second morning, she noticed something else. Frost had formed overnight on every wall joint in the mechanical bay. Thin white lines where cold air pressed through mortar gaps. Every joint except one. Behind the workbench, a rectangle of stone stayed dry. No frost, no moisture. The stones were the same color as the rest of the wall, but the mortar between them was lighter, smoother, and applied with more care. She tapped the wall with the flat of the pry bar. The first stone answered with the dull thud of solid masonry. The second was the same. The third answered hollow. Elsie knelt on the concrete floor. She brushed the mortar seam with her sleeve and found 3 stones set in a timber frame, the frame recessed so it sat flush with the wall. 4 lag bolts held the frame to the surrounding masonry. Slotted heads, not Phillips, the old kind that took a flat screwdriver or a socket. She pulled the 3/8-inch socket wrench from the wall rack, tested it on the first bolt, and began working. The bolts had not been turned in 19 years. She sprayed them with water from the hand pump, let them soak, sprayed again. She leaned her weight into the wrench handle, bracing her knee against the workbench leg. The first bolt broke free with a sound like a nail pulling from green wood. The second came easier. The third stripped its head, and she had to work the flat screwdriver in at an angle and hammer it with the palm of her hand until the bolt turned. She pried the cistern bench away from the wall with the red pry bar, the wood groaning against lag screws that held it to the floor. She cut through old tar paper with a utility knife. Then she set the pry bar into the seam of the stone panel and pressed. The panel weighed more than she expected. She worked it forward inch by inch, levering from the top, then the bottom, then the top again. Dust fell onto her wrists. Her right shoulder cramped. Red paint flaked from the pry bar handle into her palm. The panel came free and leaned against her knee. Cool air came out of the wall. Not cold. Cool. Dry, clean air that smelled like cedar and old paper. Elsie reached into the cavity and felt smooth wood, cedar boards, lining the space on all sides. She went to the truck for the flashlight. The beam lit a space roughly 4 feet deep, 5 feet wide, and 6 feet tall. Cedar-lined walls. A plank floor swept clean by someone who had swept it last. On the floor, arranged in rows, 9 black composition books stacked in 3 piles. A steel lockbox with a combination dial scratched and dented. A bundle of photographs wrapped in wax paper and tied with butcher's twine. A sealed envelope, yellowed, resting on top of the photographs. And against the back wall, a small metal filing cabinet, 4 drawers, olive green, each drawer labeled with a strip of masking tape and a letter range written in black ink, ADEHIMNZ. Elsie sat back on her heels. She looked at the cavity for a long time without reaching in. She took the composition books first. The covers were black, standard school supply type, each one labeled on the front in small, upright handwriting, 1951, 1957, 1958, 1963, 1964, 1970. She opened the first book. The pages were lined. The handwriting was neat, leaning slightly right, written with a fountain pen that had been refilled often enough to leave faint ink variations between entries. January 7th, 1956. Rusk Boy came in with ears white. Sent him home after sunrise with mittens from drawer 2. March 3rd, 1958. Replaced Haskett's stove gasket. Left it on the porch. June will think it was the hardware store. November 3rd, 1978. Paid feed bill for Haskett Place. Marked anonymous. June must not know until she can stand straight again. December 22nd, 1983. Built West-bermed higher. Men laugh at dirt until dirt saves them. Elsie read for an hour. She sat on the cold concrete floor of the mechanical bay with the composition book spread around her knees, and she read 42 years of a man's life written in notes to himself. Anton Elias Whitaker, His name appeared on the first page of the first book. He had built the switch house in 1951 as a storm refuge, a line camp, and an emergency repair stop for anyone caught west of Mercy Draw. He had maintained it for 42 years. He had sheltered ranch hands, truckers, school buses, and farm families. He had paid feed bills, clinic bills, and bus fares without signing his name. He had kept records of everyone he helped, not for credit, but for follow-up. The handwriting began neat and steady in the 1950s. By the 1990s, it had grown shakier, pressing harder into the page as if the pen needed more force to hold the line. The last entry was dated September 14, 2004. It said, "Stove cleaned, coffee on, door unlocked. Whoever comes will know what to do." Elsie opened the lockbox next. The combination had been written on a strip of masking tape inside the filing cabinet's top drawer, 9 to 3151. September 31st did not exist. She tried 9 to 3051. The lock opened. Inside, $1,824 in bundled cash, $100 bills in groups of 20, held with rubber bands that crumbled when she touched them. A manila envelope containing savings bonds totaling $29,700, all matured, and a single sheet of paper listing a local bank trust worth $87,600 dedicated to maintaining the shelter and assisting travelers. $135,700. She set the lockbox down and pressed her hands flat on her knees. The photographs. She untied the butcher's twine and unfolded the wax paper carefully. The prints were black and white in color, spanning decades. Anton standing beside the switch house in 1952, the roof half covered with fresh sod, his shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow. A line of school children drinking cocoa from tin cups after a whiteout in 1961, snow still in their hair. A young woman wrapped in a quilt holding a newborn. Elsie turned the photograph over. On the back, in Anton's handwriting, Marlene Bremer, baby girl. March 14, 1969. Elsie held the photograph in both hands. The woman was her mother. The baby was her. She set the photograph on her knee and reached for the last one. A teenage boy, lean and dark-haired, standing on a ladder beside the stovepipe with a wrench in his hand. He was grinning. On the back, Robert Calder, 17, stovepipe rebuild. Summer 1985. She closed her eyes. She opened the filing cabinet last. The drawers slid on oiled runners, smooth after 19 years. Manila folders, alphabetized by family name. Each folder held dates, descriptions, and follow-up notes. Haskett, June dinner, feed credit, furnace repair, winter coal, Rusk, Daniel, frostbite care, mittens, later apprenticeship note. Bremer, Marlene, storm birth, clinic bill, silver thimble, Calder, Robert, summer work, stovepipe training. A note in Anton's hand, good with his hands, quiet around grief. Elsie took Robert's storm notebook from the duffel bag and set it beside Anton's composition books on the workbench. She opened Robert's notebook to a page near the back. Measurements, angles, berm heights. Robert had copied some of Anton's berm specifications years ago. The numbers matched. She picked up the sealed envelope. Her name was not on it. It was addressed, "To whoever keeps the door open." Her hands were shaking before she broke the seal. The letter was written on lined paper torn from one of the composition books. The handwriting was late Anton Guy, shaky, pressed hard, but legible. If you're reading this, you found your way inside instead of walking past. That's the first right thing. This place was not built for me. It was built because the distance between Mercy Draw and the West Ranches was enough to kill a man in the wrong weather, and nobody had fixed that. I fixed it. I am not a generous man. I am a practical one. Generosity is what people call it when a practical man does what needs doing and no one else will. Everything in this room is for the building, not for you. For the building. Keep the stove clean, keep coffee on, and never let a proud man freeze because he was too foolish to listen. Elsie folded the letter and pressed it flat against her chest. She sat on the concrete floor of the mechanical bay with Anton's letter against her sternum and the photograph of her mother holding her as a newborn resting on her knee. The switch house had never been a shack. It had never been a dirt blister or a hole in the wind. It was a deliberate refuge, built by a man who understood weather, poverty, pride, and silence, and who had kept the door open for 42 years without asking anyone to notice. She set the letter on the workbench beside the journals. She placed the photograph of Robert at 17 next to it. She did not cry. She pressed her thumb into the initials he had carved into the underside of the bench, the same letters she had traced 2 days ago, and she held it there until her shoulders stopped shaking. The next morning, a cream-colored 1984 Chevy pickup came down County Road 9 without hurry. The engine had a knock in the third cylinder that Elsie could hear before the truck came into view. It pulled up 20 feet from the front door and sat idling for a moment before the driver killed the engine. June Haskett stepped out. She was thin, 72, wearing a brown barn coat with a missing button and work gloves stained dark at the fingertips. Her gray braid was pinned up with a yellow pencil. Her hands were red from dishwater. She stood beside her truck and studied the switch house for a long time before speaking. She looked at the stovepipe, cleaned, a faint ribbon of smoke rising from it. She looked at the front door, the bottom hinge reset, the door closing flush for the first time in years. She looked at Elsie's truck. She looked at Elsie. "You're the one who bought Anton's place," June said. "I'm the one who bought it." June reached into the truck bed and brought out a green Stanley thermos, 2 ham biscuits wrapped in wax paper and a paper sack. She set them on the tailgate. "Coffee's still hot. Biscuits are from this morning. Stove gaskets are in the sack. I had them in the shed since Anton's last order, and nobody else runs that model." Elsie took the thermos. The coffee was strong and black, and she drank from the blue enamel cup because the thermos cap was cracked. June told her Anton had built the switch house because there was once nowhere safe between Mercy Draw and the West Ranches. 38 miles of open prairie with no shelter, no phone, and no tree tall enough to break the wind. The ranchers called it a waste. They called the dirt roof a joke. That lasted until the blizzard of 1956, when a school bus carrying 14 children got stuck 2 miles from the switch house, and Anton walked them in through snow that reached his belt. "That place looks like a grave from the road," June said. "From inside, it's the only sensible building for 20 miles. She left with a promise to bring a coffee maker. "One good burner and no dignity left," she said. "It takes up too much counter space at the diner." Caleb Rusk walked up from the section road 3 days later. His pickup had died near the Varick fence line, something in the fuel pump, and he carried a canvas socket roll in one hand and a paper grocery bag with 2 cans of beans in the other. He was 28, broad-shouldered and hollow-cheeked, with black hair cut short under a seed company cap. His left hand carried a scar across the palm from a hay baler accident, the skin pulled tight and shiny along the lifeline. He stopped 30 feet from the switch house and studied it. He looked at the reset door hinge. He looked at the stovepipe, drawing clean. He looked at the roof berm, where Elsie had tamped fresh sod into the bare patches. He looked at Robert's storm notebook open on the enamel table through the window. He looked at Elsie. "You're bringing it back?" he said. "I'm keeping it standing." He set the grocery bag on the ground and walked to the stove without being invited. The damper was sticking half open, letting heat escape up the pipe. Caleb removed the hinge pin with a bent nail, rubbed the burr from the pivot with a strip of emery cloth he pulled from his socket roll, tapped the hinge back into alignment with the heel of his palm, and replaced the pin. He tested the draft by holding his hand over the firebox. The air pulled clean and steady. The whole thing took 6 minutes. He did not explain what he was doing before he did it. He tested the result, listened to the draft, adjusted once, and only then spoke. "It'll hold." Elsie set the blue enamel cup on the table. "I've got $40, dry floor, and bad coffee." "I'll work until Friday," Caleb said. The repairs began before sunrise each day and ran until their fingers went numb. Caleb reset the front door hinges with 3-inch screws and cedar shims, waxing the latch with beeswax from a block June brought. Elsie cleared the stovepipe with a wire brush on a rope, pulling it through from the rooftop, while Caleb held a bucket at the clean-out. They patched the pinholes in the pipe with stove cement, pressing it into each hole with a putty knife and smoothing it flat. Elsie dug drainage cuts along the west berm with a trenching shovel, cutting 2-inch channels so meltwater would run away from the wall instead of pooling against the limestone. Caleb replaced the cracked south window with a salvaged pane from the old implement dealer, bedding it in glazing putty and pinning the frame with new points. They repacked the roof's bare spots with sod squares cut from the low draw, pinning each square with willow stakes driven through the root layer. They built interior storm shutters from 3-4-inch plywood and barrel bolts, 2 for each window, stored flat against the wall and ready to be dropped into brackets. People came. June Haskett arrived with the diner coffee maker, a battered commercial bun with a cracked reservoir lid and a heating plate that worked on one side. She carried it inside and set it on the enamel table without ceremony. "It takes up too much counter space," she said. Anton had fixed her furnace during the winter her husband left. She did not say this as explanation. She said it the way a person mentions weather. Dale Norden from the hardware store drove out with a box of bent but usable hinges, a bag of 16-penny nails, and 2 tubes of caulk. He said they were headed for the scrap bin, and he didn't have room. Anton had paid for his mother's insulin for 3 years in the 1970s. Dale set the box inside the door and left without coffee. Alma Peck came in a station wagon with 4 quilts folded in garbage bags. She said the moths would get them if they stayed in her closet one more winter. She had been one of the 14 children on the school bus in 1956. She did not tell the story. She touched the doorframe on her way out the way a person touches a wall they once leaned against when they were frightened. Tomas Ibarra brought 2 cords of cottonwood in his flatbed, stacked tight. He said his sons needed the practice. Anton had repaired his father's truck for free in 1964, the night before his father drove to Bismarck for a job that kept the family fed through spring. Lila Boone brought 4 jars of beef and vegetable soup in a cardboard box. She said she'd made too much and her freezer was full. Anton had paid her hospital bill after a car wreck on the county road in 1988. She set the jars on the shelf beside the stove and left before the soup was cold. None of them lingered. None of them asked Elsie where she had come from, how much money she had, or why a 56-year-old widow had bought a dirt-roofed Quonset hut on 40 acres of frozen prairie. They came. They brought something. They connected it to Anton. They left. Caleb set June's coffee maker on the enamel table beside the blue cup. He filled the reservoir from the hand pump and plugged it into the extension cord they had run from the generator. The machine sputtered, hissed, and produced coffee that tasted like it had been stored in a radiator. But it was hot, and it was there. And when June arrived the next morning and saw it running, she poured herself a cup and sat in one of the mismatched chairs and said, "Well, that's something." The front door closed square. The windows caught clean light. The stovepipe drew without leaking. The west berm drained. The roof berm turned from ragged brown to a clean slope of buffalo grass, indistinguishable from the prairie around it. Friday came. Caleb did not leave. The black GMC Denali came down County Road 9 on a Tuesday morning, polished so clean it reflected the prairie sky in its doors. It moved through the gravel without bouncing, the suspension absorbing every rut, the kind of vehicle that cost more than most families in Mercy Draw earned in a year. Hoyt Varick stepped out. He was 61, tall, with a full head of silver hair combed back from a forehead that had never been sunburned because he wore a hat outdoors and conducted his business inside, charcoal wool coat, pressed jeans, a crocodile belt, and boots that cost more than Elsie had spent on food in 3 months. Smooth leather gloves. He studied the switch house the way a man studies a bad line item on a spreadsheet, something small that shouldn't be there, that complicates a clean page. He looked at the reset door, the clean stovepipe, the fresh sod on the berm, the generator cable, and Elsie's truck. He looked at Caleb, who was measuring plywood by the woodpile. He looked at Elsie. "Mrs. Calder," he said, "I'm Hoyt Varick. I own the land around you." "I know who you are." "Then you know I've put together a ranch plan that includes this section. Your structure sits in the middle of my operational layout." He reached into his coat and produced a business card, cream-colored, embossed. "I'm prepared to offer you $500 and a motel room in Bismarck. That's more than fair for a tax sale parcel with no utilities." The deed says this parcel is mine. Deeds are not always the end of a conversation, Mrs. Calder. Elsie turned to Hal Mercer, Varick's foreman, who stood beside the Denali with his arms folded. Hal was weathered, mid-50s, and he had the look of a man who listened more than he was paid to. The west wind shifted wrong this morning, Elsie said. There's an Alberta Clipper setting up north of Regina. When it comes through, and it will come through, your bunkhouse walls are too thin, too tall, and too exposed. The wind will take your heat faster than your heaters can replace it. Hal's eyes moved to the berm, to the stovepipe, to the shape of the building. He said nothing. Hoyt laughed. Not a cruel laugh. The laugh of a man who found irrelevant information amusing. Mrs. Calder, I own cattle, land, and men who know weather. Mind your stove. No, Elsie said. The single word sat between them. Hoyt waited for more. Nothing came. You'll hear from my attorney, he said. The Denali backed hard onto County Road 9, gravel popping under the tires like something breaking underfoot. Dust hung over the cattle guard for a full minute after he was gone. 3 days later, a sheriff's deputy pulled up in a county cruiser and handed Elsie a sealed envelope. She opened it at the enamel table beside the coffee maker. The letterhead read Varick Land Holdings, LLC. The petition listed 3 grounds: challenge to tax sale notice sufficiency, disputed access easement, and request for temporary injunction barring alteration of the property pending resolution. Elsie read temporary injunction, defective notice, and quiet title in sentences so dense they seemed designed to make understanding a luxury she could not afford. She folded the letter along its creases, set it on the table beside the blue enamel cup, and pressed her hands flat on the enamel surface. Her hands did not shake until she folded the letter. If you've made it this far into Elsie's story, hit subscribe because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. Elsie had $22.18 left. She had spent the rest on stove cement, kerosene, and a roll of emery cloth from Dale Norden's hardware store. The legal petition on the enamel table listed filing fees, service costs, and a hearing date 16 days away. A lawyer in Bismarck had quoted her $3,500 for a retainer over the phone. She had hung up without answering. She sat at the table that evening with Anton's composition book stacked beside the coffee maker, and the petition flattened under the blue enamel cup. The stove ticked as the iron cooled. Caleb sat on an overturned bucket near the door, sharpening a chisel with a whetstone, and did not ask her what the letter said. He had seen the county cruiser. He had read her face when she came inside. He kept the stone moving in steady, circular passes. June Haskett came the next morning in the cream-colored Chevy, but she was not alone. A dark green Buick followed her up the gravel road, rust blooming over both wheel wells, the exhaust pipe wired to the frame with a coat hanger. The Buick parked beside June's truck and sat with the engine running for a full minute before the driver's door opened. Clement Dole stepped out. He was 68, tall and thin, with a gray wool overcoat that hung past his knees and wire-rimmed glasses that caught the morning light. His shoes were leather, old but polished, and he carried a brown briefcase with brass latches that had been restitched along the handle. He stood beside the Buick and studied the switch house from the stovepipe to the limestone footings, his eyes moving the way a man reads a legal brief, cas, left to right, top to bottom, missing nothing. He looked at the berm. He looked at the door. He looked at Elsie. "You're Marlene Bremer's daughter," he said. "I am." "June called me last night. She said Anton's place had a new owner and Hoyt Varick had filed to take it." He set the briefcase on the tailgate of June's truck. "I'm retired. I haven't filed a motion in 6 years, but I don't think that matters here." Elsie brought him inside. She poured coffee into a mason jar because the cups were in use, and Clement drank without comment. She set the petition on the workbench beside Anton's filing cabinet, and Clement read it standing, his index finger tracking each line, pausing twice to remove his glasses and hold the page closer to the window light. He read it once for the arguments and once for the gaps. Quiet title action: challenge to the adequacy of the tax sale notice, request for temporary injunction. He set the petition down. He's not wrong that these arguments exist. He's wrong that they apply. Clement opened the filing cabinet. He pulled the drawers one at a time, reading the masking tape labels, touching the folder tabs with the care of a man who had spent his life inside filing systems and knew what careful organization meant. In the second drawer, filed under county records, he found what Anton had kept, the original 1951 deed granting the Whitaker Switch House parcel independent access from County Road 9, signed by the county surveyor and recorded with the Register of Deeds. A 1963 survey plat confirming the easement, with the lot boundaries marked in red ink and the road frontage measured to the tenth of a chain. A 1974 grazing lease between Anton and the previous Varick operation that specifically excluded the shelter lot from ranch use. And a 2005 probate notice, earth-bermed, filed after Anton's death, showing the parcel had passed through a trust and been offered at tax sale after 2 years of delinquency, with no competing claim recorded. Clement laid the documents on the workbench in a row. He aligned the edges the way a man aligns evidence on a conference table. The tax sale followed the statutory notice requirements. The easement is deeded, not permissive. The grazing lease carved the parcel out in writing, and the probate file shows no Varick heir or assignee ever filed an interest. He looked at Elsie. Anton kept better records than most lawyers I've worked with. What do you charge? Elsie asked. Clement took off his glasses and cleaned them with a handkerchief from his coat pocket. He held them up to the window light, checked for smudges, and put them back on. My fee was paid 51 years ago by a man who never let me thank him. He did not explain further. He did not need to. Elsie had read the composition book entries from the 1970s. She knew Anton had paid bus fares and book costs for students who could not afford them. She did not ask which entry was Clement's. The hearing was held on a Thursday morning in the county building in Mercy Draw, a single-story brick structure with a flagpole out front and snow dusting the windowsills. The hearing room seated 40 in wooden gallery benches that had been varnished so many times the armrests were sticky in summer. The judge, Margaret Freed, sat behind a raised desk with the county seal on the wall above her and a space heater running under the bench because the building's furnace had not worked properly since 2019. Varick's attorney, a man named Pritchard from Bismarck in a navy suit and tortoiseshell glasses, sat at the left table with 2 file boxes and a laptop. Hoyt Varick sat behind him in the gallery, charcoal coat folded over his lap, legs crossed, his face as composed as a man waiting for a board meeting to start. Elsie sat at the right table with Clement Dole. Her hands were in her lap. The blue enamel cup sat on the table beside Clement's briefcase because she had carried it from the truck without thinking and set it down before she realized where she was. June sat in the gallery 3 rows back. Caleb stood against the back wall with his arms crossed and sawdust still on his sleeves because he had come straight from cutting plywood shutters. Pritchard presented the petition. He argued the tax sale notice had been published in a newspaper with insufficient county circulation. He argued the access easement was ambiguous and functionally absorbed by Varick's surrounding operations. He cited 3 state court decisions and read from a land use treatise. He requested the injunction to prevent further alteration of the structure pending resolution. Clement stood. He did not open with citations. He opened with the deed. He presented the 1951 deed, the 1963 survey, the 1974 grazing lease, and the 2005 probate notice. He presented Anton's maintenance records, 42 years of dated entries proving continuous, independent use of the parcel. He presented the county's own tax sale publication records showing the notice had run for 3 consecutive weeks in the county's paper of record, as required by statute. The easement is not ambiguous, Clement said. It is deeded. It is surveyed. It is recorded. It has been in continuous use since 1951. The grazing lease excludes the shelter parcel in writing. The tax sale followed statutory procedure. No Varick interest was recorded at any point in the chain of title. The petitioner's claim is not that the sale was defective. The petitioner's claim is that the sale was inconvenient. Judge Freed reviewed the documents for 11 minutes. The courtroom was quiet except for the radiator clicking against the north wall and the sound of paper turning. Elsie watched the judge's eyes move across the survey plat, pause at the lot boundaries, then move to the lease. Pritchard shifted in his chair. Hoyt did not move. The petition for temporary injunction is denied, Judge Freed said. The tax sale stands. The chain of title is clear. The easement is deeded and recorded. This court finds no basis for the quiet title action as pleaded. She closed the file. Mrs. Calder, the property is yours. Elsie's thumb found the chipped rim of the blue enamel cup on the table beside her. She slid her thumb along the white chip where the enamel had flaked away, the rough edge she had touched 1,000 times. Her shoulders dropped an inch. Her breath came out in a single long exhale that she had been holding since the sheriff's deputy handed her the envelope 16 days ago. Clement gathered his papers. He shook Elsie's hand once firmly and said, Anton would have liked the stovepipe. It draws clean. Outside, the snow had stopped. Elsie stood on the courthouse steps and watched Hoyt Varick's Denali pull out of the lot without stopping. Caleb leaned against the Ranger in the parking lot with his arms crossed, and June sat in the Chevy with the engine running and the window down. Well? June said. It's mine, Elsie said. June nodded once. Good. I brought soup. The hearing was on a Thursday. The following Monday, Elsie went back to the filing cabinet. She had not opened every folder. During the legal preparation, Clement had pulled specific documents, deeds, surveys, leases, from the county records section. But the alphabetical folders, the ones with family names and follow-up notes, she had only skimmed. She had read the Haskett file, the Rusk file, the Calder file. She had not read the Bremer file completely. She opened it now because Clement had mentioned something in the car on the way back from the hearing. He had said, Your maiden name is in the index twice, once under B, once cross-referenced under C. She had not asked what he meant. She had been too tired to ask and too careful to ask in front of anyone. The Bremer folder was thicker than she expected. She pulled it from the drawer and sat at the workbench with Anton's reading lamp. A bent-neck desk lamp Caleb had rewired 2 days ago, casting a circle of yellow light on the pages. The first page was the entry she already knew. Marlene Bremer, March 14th, 1969. Storm birth. North road closed. Boiled water. Sent for Doc Havel when wind dropped. Mother and baby stayed 3 days. Clinic bill, 2 of 14 hours, paid from trust, marked anonymous. The second page was a follow-up note dated June 1969. Marlene doing well. Baby healthy. Gave the thimble. It was my mother's. Marlene's hands are the right size for it. Elsie stopped reading. She took the tobacco tin from the duffel bag. She unwrapped the yellow flour sack cloth. The silver thimble lay in her palm, tarnished, engraved with the initials EB, flattened slightly on one side from years of pressure against fabric and skin. EB she had always assumed the initials were her grandmother's, Elsa Bremer. Her mother had told her so when Elsie was 9 years old and asked why the letters did not match her own name. She turned back to the folder. A third page, dated September 1970. Checked on Bremer girl. Growing fast. Marlene says she has my mother's hands. Told her the thimble would fit when the time came. A fourth page, December 1971. Marlene married, moved to the Calder farm. The baby will grow up 9 miles from this building and never know she was born inside it. A fifth page, dated 1985, in handwriting that had begun to slant and press harder into the lined paper. Robert Calder came to help with the stovepipe. 17 years old. Quiet boy. Good with his hands. He does not know the girl he will marry was born on this floor. I will not tell him. Some things work better when people find them on their own. Elsie set the folder on the bench. Her hands were shaking. The pages moved against each other with a sound like dry leaves turning in a gutter. She stood from the workbench and walked to the root cellar steps because her legs would not hold her standing. She sat on the second step, the stone cold through her jeans, and the folder rattled in her lap. She took the silver thimble from the tobacco tin and held it against her chest. E.B., not Elsa Bremer, Eva Whittaker, Anton's mother. The thimble had come from Anton's mother to Anton, from Anton to Marlene, from Marlene to Elsie. It had traveled from one woman's hands to the next across 3 generations and landed in a tobacco tin inside a duffel bag inside a truck parked behind a closed feed store on the coldest night of Elsie's life. And Elsie had carried it without knowing where it came from or what floor it had crossed first. She had been born here. 56 years ago, in a blizzard, on the plank boards, 8 feet from where she now sat. Her mother had been wrapped in a quilt and held by a man who boiled water and sent for a doctor when the wind dropped and paid the clinic bill and gave away his mother's thimble and never told anyone. The mechanical bay was quiet. The stove ticked. The reading lamp hummed. Outside, wind moved across the roof berm and passed over without catching, the same way it had passed over on the night she was born. "I was here before I had a name," Elsie said. Her voice was steady. Her hands were not. She held the thimble against her sternum and pressed until she could feel the flat side of it against her collarbone. She sat on the root cellar steps for a long time. She did not stand until the lamp began to flicker and the stove needed another log. The property stopped being a desperate purchase. It stopped being a tax sale gamble, or a shelter from the wind, or a building she had saved from demolition. It became the place that had held her life open before she knew she had one. Beth Calder arrived on a Saturday afternoon in a rented white Nissan sedan that fishtailed twice on the gravel before coming to a stop 15 feet from the front door. The tires were wrong for the surface. The car was wrong for the road. Beth stepped out wearing city shoes, leather flats with no tread, and a wool coat that reached her knees but could not have been rated below 40 degrees. She stood beside the car and looked at the switch house the way a person looks at a medical chart they are afraid to read. She saw the dirt mound, the stovepipe, the corrugated steel where the berm ended, the buffalo grass on the roof. She saw Caleb measuring a timber brace by the woodpile, a pencil behind his ear, and sawdust on his forearms. She saw June Haskett's Chevy parked near the cistern, and through the front window she saw the coffee maker running and 2 people sitting at the enamel table. She did not come inside for 10 minutes. She stood beside the rental car with her arms crossed and her shoulders pulled up against the wind, watching. Elsie came out. She did not hug Beth. She did not ask why Beth had come or why she had not answered the phone. She said, "Coffee's on. Wind's going to pick up by 4. Beth followed her inside. She expected filth. She expected confusion. She expected to find evidence that grief had broken her mother's mind, spoiled food, disorganized piles, the smell of someone who had stopped caring. She expected to find proof that she had been right to stop answering. The stove was clean and drawing well. The windows were patched and clear. The floor was swept. Robert's storm notebook lay open on the workbench beside Anton's composition books, the pages weighted with a smooth river stone. The blue enamel cup sat beside the coffee maker with coffee still warm in it. Quilts were folded on the chairs. Jars of soup lined the shelf. The air smelled like cedar, wood smoke, and coffee. June poured Beth a cup without asking if she wanted one. Beth held it with both hands because the ceramic was warm and her fingers were numb. "This is June Haskett," Elsie said. "She owns the diner. That's Caleb Rusk outside. He's been working with me since the first week." Beth nodded. She did not speak. She was recalibrating. That afternoon, 2 young ranch hands from a spread south of Mercy Draw pulled up in a flatbed with a load of fence posts. They had driven into the north draw to unload and were angling the truck toward the low ground when Elsie came outside. "Move the truck," Elsie said. "Not there. Back it up to the east side of the draw, above the cut bank." One of the boys, 19, sunburned, still wearing a jean jacket in December, looked at her sideways. "Ma'am, we always unload in the low spot. The wind is going to shift northwest by tonight. When it does, any drift that forms in that draw will bury your truck to the axles and you'll walk home. Back it up to the east side. Unload on the high ground." The boy looked at Caleb. Caleb said nothing. He was fitting a plywood shutter into its brackets on the south window. The boy looked at Elsie again. He backed the truck up. Beth watched this from the doorway. She watched the boys obey without laughing. She watched Caleb nod once without turning around. She watched her mother walk back inside, pour herself half a cup of coffee, and sit down at the table to review Anton's drainage notes, as if nothing remarkable had happened. That evening, Beth and Elsie sat at the enamel table after June had gone, and Caleb had walked out to check the generator. The stove popped once and settled. The lamp made a circle of light on the workbench. The composition books were stacked neatly beside the photographs, and the photograph of Marlene Bremer holding newborn Elsie lay on top. I stopped answering because every call sounded like another emergency I couldn't fix, Beth said. She held the blue enamel cup because Elsie had handed it to her without explanation, and Beth had not set it down. Every time the phone rang, I thought, this is the one where she asked me to come save her, and I can't. I don't know how. Elsie did not defend herself. She did not explain the foreclosure, or the auction, or the $31, or the nights in the truck behind the feed store. She picked up the photograph and slid it across the table. That's your grandmother. That's me. I was born in this building. Beth looked at the photograph for a long time. She turned it over and read Anton's handwriting on the back. She looked at the composition books. She looked at the thimble on the chain around Elsie's neck. You weren't disappearing, Beth said. No. I thought you were disappearing. I didn't know you were becoming yourself again. They sat in the quiet. It was not the silence of 4 unanswered phone calls. It was a different silence, the kind that comes when 2 people stop needing to explain and start needing to breathe in the same room. Beth stayed the night. She folded quilts, labeled the medical supplies June had brought in a shoebox, and slept on the floor near the stove with her wool coat over Alma Peck's thickest quilt. In the morning, she stood at the kitchen counter with her hair uncombed and her city shoes still by the door. Where are the coffee filters? She asked. The temperature dropped 60 degrees between 2 in the afternoon and 8 in the evening. Elsie had watched the barometer all day. She had watched the cloud base lower, flatten, and turn the color of cast iron. She had watched the wind back from west to northwest and felt the air pressure change in her sinuses the way her father had taught her. Not through instruments, but through the bones of her face. By 4 o'clock, she told Caleb to stack 3 extra loads of cottonwood inside the mudroom. By 5, she bolted the storm shutters on both windows. By 6, the wind was screaming across the flat prairie at 55 miles an hour, driving snow horizontally, turning the air white and solid. The temperature at 7 was -12. The wind chill pushed it past -40. The switch house held. The berms absorbed the wind. The curved roof let it pass overhead without catching a flat surface. The limestone footings did not shift. The sod insulation, 18 inches of packed earth on 3 sides and the roof, kept the interior at 48 degrees with the stove running at half load. The building did what Anton had built it to do 75 years earlier for exactly this weather, on exactly this kind of night. Half a mile east, the Varick bunkhouse was dying. The building was long, thin, and tall, the worst possible shape for a plane storm. The walls were framed with 204 studs and sheathed with oriented strand board, standard construction for a temperate climate, useless against an Alberta Clipper. The wind hit the broad face of the building at 55 miles an hour and pushed through every gap, chinking cracks, electrical outlets, the spaces around window frames where caulk had not been applied or had already cracked in the cold. Nails popped from the sheathing as the wood contracted. The heating system, or electric baseboard units rated for 20-degree nights, could not replace heat as fast as the wind stripped it from the walls. The indoor temperature dropped from 62 to 44 in the first hour. By the second hour, it was 31. By 8 o'clock, the men inside were wearing every layer they owned. By 9, they were wrapping themselves in bedding and horse blankets. By 10, 2 men in the north end of the bunkhouse had stopped shivering, which was worse than shivering. The body shivers to generate heat. When it stops, it means the body has given up trying. Hal Mercer remembered Elsie's warning. He remembered the shape of the switch house, the way the wind passed over the curved roof, the way the berms deflected drift lines, the way the stovepipe drew clean in the December cold while the Varick heaters whined and failed. He started the first truck. Caleb saw the headlights wavering through the snow on the section road. Single beams drifting left and right, the trucks moving by memory because visibility was less than 20 feet. "Elsie," he said. She was already moving. She opened the stove damper to full. She pulled every quilt from the shelf. She filled every pot and pan with water and set them on the stove. She started the coffee maker. She cleared the main room floor. "Beth, get the door," she said. "Caleb, lanterns on the porch rail. They won't see the building until they're on top of it." The first truck held 8 men. They came through the door in a cloud of snow and frozen air, stamping their boots, their faces red and white in patches, their hands balled inside their sleeves. The second truck held 11. 2 men were carried between the others, arms over shoulders, their legs buckling in the mudroom, then more on foot, 4, then 6, then 3 more, stumbling up from the section road where the bunkhouse van had slid into the ditch and buried its axle in frozen mud. Each man paused inside the door. The heat hit them like a wall. The curved ceiling held warmth the way a cave holds warmth, radiating it back from every surface, the packed earth and the steel ribs and the sod overhead, all giving back what the stove put in. Men who had been shaking stopped shaking. Men who had been silent started cursing, which meant their brains were warming. A 22-year-old cowboy named Price sat on the floor beside the stove and cried without making a sound, his hands open on his knees, the tears running into the collar of his coat. Elsie moved through the room, checking hands and feet. She bent the fingers of every man who came through the door, looking for the white, waxy skin that meant frostbite had moved past the surface. She wrapped 2 sets of hands in warm, wet cloths, not hot, warm, because hot water on frozen skin causes more damage than the cold. She poured coffee into every cup, mug, and jar she could find. Beth labeled names on strips of masking tape and stuck them to the wall beside the men who could not stand, so she could check on them by name instead of by injury. 50 men filled the switch house from the mudroom to the root cellar steps. The building held them all. It held them because Anton had built the walls 18 inches thick and buried them in earth. It held them because the curved roof was not a shape that wind could grab. It held them because Elsie had cleaned the stove, repacked the berms, cut the drainage channels, and kept the building alive when everyone else called it a dirt hole. Hoyt Varick arrived last. He came through the door without his hat. His face was gray. One glove was missing, the bare hand tucked against his stomach. His charcoal coat was gone. He wore a canvas ranch jacket too thin for the weather, and snow had melted into the collar and frozen there in a ridge of ice. He had no speech ready. He had no offer. He had no business card. He stood in the mudroom while Elsie knelt beside a young cowboy named Torres and checked his fingers one by one, bending each joint, pressing the nail beds, watching for the color to return. "Sit down," Elsie said without looking up. "Take your boots off." Hoyt sat on the mudroom bench. He pulled his boots off with hands that shook so badly Caleb had to hold the heel while Hoyt pulled. His socks were wet. His toes were red but not white. He would keep them. He did not speak for an hour. He sat on the bench and watched Elsie move through the room, directing Caleb and Beth and June, who had driven through the storm in the cream-colored Chevy with chains on the tires and a trunk full of bread, canned soup, and blankets. After midnight, Hoyt knelt beside 2 of his own men and helped remove their frozen boots. He unlaced them carefully, working the stiff leather loose where it had frozen around swollen ankles. He did what Elsie told him. He did not argue once. By 3 in the morning, the wind had not stopped, but every man inside the switch house was warm, fed, and breathing normally. Price had fallen asleep beside the stove with a quilt pulled over his shoulders. Torres was flexing his fingers and watching the color come back. Hal Mercer sat in one of the mismatched chairs at the enamel table with a cup of coffee and the expression of a man who was rearranging everything he thought he knew. Dawn came gray and still. The wind dropped to 20 miles an hour. Snow lay in drifts 6 feet deep along the section road, but the switch house door opened clean because the berm deflected the drift line 10 feet to the east, the way Anton had designed it. Elsie found Hoyt standing outside by the woodpile. She carried a manila folder. "This was in Anton's cabinet," she said, "filed under V." Hoyt took the folder. Inside was a single page, dated March 1971, in Anton's neat early handwriting. Barrack placed behind on feed again. Winter killed 40 head, paid the balance at the co-op, marked anonymous. The boy is 6. He should not lose his home because his father cannot count cattle. The boy was Hoyt. He had been 6 years old. Hoyt read the page standing beside the woodpile with snow on his shoulders and his bare hand holding the folder open against the wind. He read it twice. He closed the folder and held it against his leg with both hands. He did not read it in front of his men. He left that morning with his crew in the trucks they could dig out. He did not say goodbye. He did not apologize. He carried the folder in his jacket. 1 week later, a mud-spattered Ford farm truck came down County Road 9. No Denali, no polish, no charcoal coat. Hoyt Varick stepped out in work boots, canvas Carhartt jacket, and a wool cap pulled low over his ears. Behind his truck, a flatbed carried 40 sheets of plywood, 12 rolls of mineral wool insulation, and 2 pallets of split firewood. 3 ranch hands rode in the flatbed, paid for the day. Hoyt walked to the front door where Elsie stood with the blue enamel cup in her hand. "Where do you want it?" he said. "Stack the plywood inside." "All right." He turned to his men and started unloading. He carried plywood on his shoulder with the ranch hands, stacking it against the mechanical bay wall where Elsie pointed. He worked for 4 hours without stopping except for coffee, which he drank from a jar because every cup was in use. When the flatbed was empty, he stood by his truck with his hands in his jacket pockets. "The bunkhouse is getting rebuilt," he said. "Thicker walls, lower roof line, bermed on the north and west." Elsie nodded. "I hired an engineer from Bismarck. He asked what design I wanted." Hoyt looked at the switch house, the curved roof, the sod berms, the clean stovepipe trailing smoke into the pale sky. "I told him to come look at this." He got in the truck and drove away. The mud tires left tracks in the snow that filled in within the hour. 5 months later, the buffalo grass on the roof berm was green and thick, waving in a wind that had turned warm and smelled like rain and new soil. The dead cottonwood near the draw had fallen during a March storm, and Caleb had bucked it into rounds that were now stacked against the west berm, seasoning for next winter. Wildflowers, purple prairie clover and blanket flower, had come up along the drainage cuts Elsie had dug in December, the roots following the water channels the way roots always follow water when someone gives them a path. The Whitaker Switch House was officially listed as a county emergency warming station. A small wooden sign beside the front door, painted by June Haskett's granddaughter in careful block letters, read, "Coffee on. Come in." The stove had been rebuilt with a new firebox liner Caleb had welded from plate steel. The windows had proper storm glass. The generator had been replaced with a propane unit that started in any weather. The root cellar held 200 jars of canned goods, soup, beans, tomatoes, peaches, donated by families whose names filled Anton's composition books. The cistern had been reconnected to a rainwater collection system that Caleb and Thomas Ibarra's sons had assembled from salvaged guttering and a food-grade plastic tank. Elsie ran storm preparedness classes on the first Saturday of every month. Ranchers, school bus drivers, and county road crews sat in the mismatched chairs and on overturned buckets while she taught them how to read a barometer drop, how to bank a fire for 12 hours, how to check a person's hands for frostbite, and how to calculate wind chill from temperature and wind speed using the chart she had taped to the wall beside the stove. She had activated Anton's trust with Clement Dole's help and started the Whitaker Calder Emergency Fund, a continuation of what Anton had done for 42 years, now with a name and a bank account and a woman who answered the phone. The fund paid heating bills for families behind on propane, covered emergency feed costs after bad storms, and kept $500 in cash at the switch house for anyone who arrived with nothing. On a Saturday evening in late May, the switch house was full. June served coffee from behind the enamel table, the diner coffee maker running on both burners now because Caleb had rewired the second heating element with parts from a junked appliance he had found behind Dale Norden's store. Caleb stood near the mechanical bay showing 2 teenagers how to clean a stovepipe with a wire brush. The right angle, the right pressure, the right number of passes to clear creosote without scoring the flue liner. Beth had driven in from 3 counties east with a box of medical kits she had assembled herself. Gauze, tape, antiseptic, thermal blankets, glucose tablets, splints. She came every other weekend now. She stayed through Sunday. Tomas Ibarra's son stacked firewood along the east wall without being asked, the cottonwood rounds standing on end in tight rows that would dry through summer and burn clean by October. Alma Peck sat in the chair nearest the stove, the same chair she always chose, and she was telling a 10-year-old boy the story of the school bus in 1956, the 14 children, the walk through the snow, the cocoa Anton had ready when they came through the door. Dale Norden had brought a new set of hinges, still in the packaging, and left them on the workbench with a note that said, "For when you need them." Outside, Hoyt Varick's ranch hands unloaded firewood from a flatbed. They came once a month now. They did not announce themselves. They stacked the wood, drank a cup of coffee, and left. Hoyt did not come himself every time, but his truck was parked at the end of County Road 9 today, and he sat on the tailgate with Hal Mercer, both of them drinking coffee from jars, watching the light change over the prairie. Evening came slowly, the way it does on the plains in late spring, when the sun takes an hour to cross the last hand's width of sky. The light turned pale gold over the flat fields, then copper, then a blue so deep it looked like water pooling at the edges of the world. The repaired stovepipe gave off a clean ribbon of smoke that rose straight in the still air before bending south toward Mercy Draw. The lights inside the switch house came on, the desk lamp, the overhead bulb Caleb had wired to the new generator, the warm glow of the stove through the firebox glass. Robert's storm notebook lay open on the workbench beside Anton's composition books, the pages still weighted with the smooth river stone. The handwriting in both books, Robert's square block letters, Anton's neat slanting script, faced each other across the workbench like two men who had never met in life but had been working on the same problem from opposite ends. The blue enamel cup sat beside the coffee maker, the white chip on the rim catching the lamplight. Someone had filled it with coffee and left it there, the way you leave a place set for someone who is expected. Elsie wore the silver thimble on a chain under her shirt. She touched it once through the flannel as she stood in the doorway and watched the last light flatten across the fields. The red-handled pry bar hung on the tool wall behind her, cleaned but not repainted, the groove where Robert's grease had been worn smooth by Elsie's palm over 5 months of opening sealed things and building them back. The stars came out. They appeared one at a time over the ridgeline to the east, then in clusters, then in sheets, until the sky was so full of them that the edges blurred and the darkness between them shrank to almost nothing. The kind of sky that only exists where the nearest streetlight is 10 miles away and the nearest tall building is in another state. Home was not the place that kept the wind away. Home was the door left open when the wind came. The switch house door stood open. Warm light spilled across the dirt threshold and fell in a long yellow rectangle onto the ground, turning soft with spring. Beyond it, the prairie waited for morning.